So it's 103 degrees in Portland this weekend. It is absolutely hellish. It's cool in here, so I'm in here with the 3 dogs. My filmer Jacob is actually out of town visiting his dad. So I actually did a Q&A recently on my Instagram asking like what kind of content that you guys wanted to see from me besides the usual putting cars together, cars drifting, and so on and so forth. And I got a bunch of really good responses, so thank you guys for that. One of my favorites out of all of them was like a history type video. And that got me thinking like, man, there's been a lot of history here and you guys probably don't know any of it. It's been a long road getting here to where I am now in life and in drifting and stuff. And with all 3 of my cars currently under the knife, I figured now is a pretty good time to do some cool videos like this and let you guys get to know me a little bit better. I actually didn't get into cars until I was like 24 years old, 25 years old. For most of my life leading up to that point, I actually barely even owned a car. I was really into cycling. I used to be a bicycle messenger and I was really involved in fixed gear culture back in Portland in like the late aughts and the early 2010s. I loved putting together fixed gear bikes and like sourcing all the rarest like Japanese track frames and all the rare parts and stuff like that. And I feel like that kind of had an influence on my desire to get into building cars. It's kind of the same thing, but just scaled down with cheaper stuff and sort of the same overall goal though, which is to build something unique, something that's not off the shelf. It's got some cool stuff on it, but also serves a purpose and does the job really well. And I feel like I've actually ended up applying a lot of those same principles to the way that I built cars. But that's not all that I did back then. I actually spent the majority of my early 20s living out of my backpack and just hitchhiking, hopping freight trains, and cruising around the country without a care in the world and no money, and just seeing where I could go and where I would end up. It's definitely a type of lifestyle that's not for everybody. I had a lot of long cold nights. I used to walk down the freeway so often that walking 10 miles down the freeway was just another day. I didn't even think twice about it. And I ended up seeing some really cool stuff, and I ended up going through some pretty crazy shit during that time. And we could dig into stories from that. There are endless stories from that. That's a whole nother video in and of itself. But yeah, so I was actually on a hitchhiking trip to Louisiana in 2010, and I hopped freight trains and hitchhiked down the West Coast. We crossed through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and into Louisiana, and I was with 3 of my best friends at the time. And in Louisiana was actually where we all kind of decided to part ways and go back to our own respective homes or parts of the country and stuff like that. I actually ended up hitchhiking from New Orleans, Louisiana, all the way across the state to Shreveport to catch a ride. And I spent 5 days hitchhiking all the major highways down there. And I'm not sure if any of you guys have been through that part of the country, but these highways are on these massive levees in a swamp. So there's just no reprieve. There's nowhere to get off. There's nowhere to sleep. And it was a really gnarly experience. And so once I returned from that trip, I was in Portland just sort of kicking around, not really doing anything with any sort of distinct plan. I was actually at some random bar sometime between Christmas and before New Year, and I ended up meeting this girl, and we had like this little like 2-day thing. And then she was actually from New York City and lived in Brooklyn, worked in Manhattan, and we actually never stopped talking. And come February of 2011, she invited me to come stay with her in Brooklyn for a while. And I had just enough money to make it there on a one-way plane ticket with absolutely no plan, no job lined up, no return trip. And I'd only known this girl for like 2 days. And it was really not that out of the realm of normalcy for me to do something like that back then. And so sure enough, I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. This girl is actually like 7 years older than me. She was an attorney and she was a super fun chick. We ended up going our separate ways, but at the time she wanted me to come. So I said I was gonna come. And then the day before I went to New York City, she actually called me and said, no, don't come. I don't want you to come. This is too much, blah, blah, blah. And I ended up telling her, well, listen, I'm coming on this plane, whether you want me to come or not. If you don't want to meet me at the airport, that's fine. I'll figure it out. I'll just stay in New York for a couple of weeks and then I'll hitchhike back to Portland. And doing a cross-country trip by myself, hitchhiking, definitely was pretty extreme, but it was not something that I wouldn't have done back then. I had a lot of experience doing that type of thing, and I was ready to just suck it up and just catch rides all the way back if shit went haywire. So anyway, off I went. It was late January when I flew over there, and I ended up landing there, and I started work as a bicycle mechanic actually at a place right off Central Park in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It was a really cool job. It was floor to ceiling windows, really nice open lit work area, and I basically just wrenched on bicycles for the richest zip code in the entire United States. I bumped into a lot of celebrities when I worked there. I did a lot of really weird stuff, like inflate the tires of a dog stroller for like these super vampy old women that are like pushing 4 freaking chihuahuas down the street in their 4-dog stroller. So it was quite a culture shock, really, really crazy experience. And when you work as a bicycle mechanic in the bicycle industry, working weekends is pretty much just a must. It just happens. And what ended up happening is that I landed on the ground. The girl did meet me at the airport, so we ended up kind of getting together, and she was letting me stay at her house, and it kind of blossomed into a relationship. And as soon as I moved there, we actually never ended up getting a single day off together for the entire time I was there. So I ended up looking for a job as a bicycle messenger because they work the normal Monday through Friday work week, and then we ended up getting weekends off. So I picked up a job and I went for my first couple of days, and then on February 11th, after she got off work at her law office, I was riding my bike to go meet her for dinner, and I actually got ran over by a semi-truck. And that semi-truck ran completely over me, over my left leg, and basically did just about everything but break it clean off. Luckily, it landed evenly between my knee and my ankle and didn't crush my knee or my ankle, but it degloved my leg entirely. So it ripped all this skin off of my leg completely. So it was just bone and muscle. It was absolutely disgusting. And I was bleeding really fast. I thought for sure I was gonna die. And turns out an ambulance showed up in about 7 minutes. I had already lost about 1.5 pints of blood at that time. They peeled me off the street, put me on a gurney, picked up the chunks of skin and whatever that were still attached to me and set them on the stretcher next to me. I specifically remember that. I was so afraid that I was gonna die that I refused to give up my consciousness because I thought that if I passed out, I would probably die. And we ended up going straight to the ICU, where I had a 7.5-hour emergency surgery where they were tying off blood vessels and doing all this stuff, thinking they were going to eventually amputate my leg, but that they had to stabilize me enough so that I wouldn't die right there. And what ensued from that is an approximate 5-week stay in the ICU in 2 different hospitals, one state hospital in Brooklyn and one in Manhattan. At the state hospital in Brooklyn, they tried a whole bunch of stuff to save my leg, and they were not able to. And my leg was beginning to become necrotic, and they were talking about amputating my leg. And they scheduled the amputation actually 5 days out from the time when they told me they were going to amputate it. And my ex-girlfriend at the time refused to entertain the idea that I was going to lose my leg. She threatened to sue the hospital if they didn't release me to a better hospital. And so after she kind of flexed her like legalese on them and they finally released me, I ended up going to a private hospital in Manhattan called the Weill Cornell Medical Center, where I actually was in the ICU there for 3 more weeks. And They did about 70 to 80 procedures on me from the beginning of my accident until the day I was released. They actually had to end up undoing all of the work that the previous hospital had done to try to prepare my leg for amputation. And just by like by the skin on my leg, like I was able to keep my leg. I ended up getting skin grafts on a large portion of my leg, and when they released me from the hospital, they had no idea whether or not I was going to be able to walk or whether the skin grafts were going to take. It was all kind of a crapshoot, because when you get that hurt, the doctors can't really tell you. They're not going to be like, oh yeah, you're going to be fine, man, or you're going to walk in a week. It's not like casting something up while it heals and then 4 weeks later you're on the road. It's one of those things where it's like, okay, we did the best we could. We used all the technology that we had and all of our expertise, and now only time will tell. And so that began a about 1.5 year recovery process where I was at first in a wheelchair. I moved on to crutches. I had 2,800 stitches and staples in my leg that ended up needing to be removed one by one as they kind of worked their way out of the skin graft that I had to do at home with needle nose pliers. It was 4 dressing changes a day, 14 prescribed medications, physical therapy 3 days a week, and a taxi cab because I couldn't get on the subway and get to physical therapy. So it was taxis everywhere that I went. This was kind of before Uber and stuff like that. And during that time, I ended up spending a lot of time on the internet. And at the time, I really was beginning to get jaded about the idea of living permanently in New York and not getting to work doing something fun. The accident kind of screwed me up so bad that I just had no interest in working in the bicycle industry anymore. And due to that, I really didn't want to try to just become yet another service industry employee in New York City, because frankly, New York can be really fun with the right lifestyle, but it can be really brutal if you're not making enough money, because everything there is really, really expensive. And during that time, I was 26 and I had never really done anything with my life yet of any substance. I just kind of lived out of backpacks and cruised around and hung out in one city for a couple of months, hitchhiked to the next city, hung out there, got bored, went back to Portland, worked for a couple months as a bicycle mechanic, ran some packages, got bored of that. Off I went on the freeway hitchhiking, and it just kind of went on like that from about age 18 to 26. There's a lot of crazy stories from that time that maybe we can do another video about, but I didn't want to continue to do that for the rest of my life. And I certainly didn't want to be 30, crippled, and living out of a backpack on the streets, because that sounded pretty fucking horrible. I was kind of looking around on the internet for something that was going to entice me to begin doing something with my life, something that I could do physically, something that was exciting. So that's kind of where drifting steps in. And I used to have this roommate named Marcus. I lived in this really shitty punk house in Portland in like 2008. And my old roommate Marcus had an 88.6 Corolla all the way back then. And at that time, I had no idea what drifting was. I had no idea about cars. I basically thought even if you owned a car at that point that you were like rich, because I was so used to just living on the road and being a total minimalist. Back in 2008, my roommate Marcus actually took me out drifting a couple of times, just hitting on-ramps and stuff like that. He was like really into the culture way before I ever took off here in the United States. And I thought it was like the most exhilarating, rad thing that I've ever done. But I kind of just likened it to this like rich boy shit where I was like, I'm never going to be able to afford this. I'm never going to be able to even afford a car, blah, blah, blah. And so it was kind of out of sight, out of mind at the time. So fast forward to after the accident, and I'm looking at my life and thinking, well, what am I going to do with myself? That's when I kind of started thinking about drifting again. And I was like, well, that was always like really fun. I think I want to try that out maybe. What is that like? And so I started researching it, and this was in 2011 or 2012 at this point. If you rewind back to 2012 drifting, you're thinking about like Tandem of Die, Hoonigan and Hurt were just beginning to gain a bunch of popularity. So Animal Style was around. They hadn't even yet painted their cars red. This was that period in American drifting where things were really starting to pick up though. There were a bunch of amazing content creators. There were all these amazing cars beginning to come out, and the culture itself was really beginning to take off. And this was just a complete culture shock to me at the time. I literally was like, oh my God, this is the craziest shit I've ever seen. I'd never even really seen cars like that, let alone seeing them being driven door to door in tandem drift. And I didn't even really know that tandem drift was a thing. And I was like, that literally looks like the funnest thing ever. And I wanted to do it more than anything. I was kind of pigeonholed in my lifestyle in New York because you can't get a garage in New York without spending as much as you do on the apartment. My girlfriend at the time, her job was not gonna move. She was a New Yorker. She didn't really want to change all that up. I was left at this crossroads in my life where I was like, is this gonna be like a dream for me, or is this gonna be something that I'm actually going to pursue? And I actually took the plunge. I decided in New York that I was going to move back to my home state of Oregon, and I was going to pursue building drift cars with absolutely no experience working on them, no experience driving a car besides just daily driving. I had no idea how to modify a car or even what it took to modify one. I really just knew nothing, but I figured that I would just teach myself as I went, and that it wasn't gonna happen if I stayed in New York. So I actually bought a broken down school bus in Queens, New York that had 3 seized brake calipers and no paperwork from some sketchy dudes. And I literally drove it across the country with everything that I owned and absolutely no plan. I took $6,000 with me, and I ended up spending the entire summer crossing the country, picking up random people, staying in random places. I went to upstate New York. I went all through Iowa and Pennsylvania and Colorado, and man, it was a crazy trip. It was another one of those trips that could be its own video. I'll try to dig up some video clips from it. Back in the day, I wasn't really all about like capturing stuff for content purposes. I was just kind of living my life, so I don't know if I can find anything from that, but I'll try. And when I got to Portland, I began to set forth in motion the plan to get involved with cars in some way. And I started buying some rear-wheel drive cars, kind of trying out different stuff. I bought an old 70s Corolla. I bought a couple of BMWs, a couple of E34s, and actually an E30. I actually ended up buying a Mazda RX-7 with an LS1 swap, running and driving in an amazing shape for $7,000. And so that, man, if only you could do that these days. Not possible. But yeah, so I bought a $7,000 LS swapped FC RX-7, and I got the thing home, and I decided to myself, I'm gonna learn how to drive the living shit out of this car. I'm gonna build it so that it's the craziest RX-7 that the world has ever seen. And I'm gonna try to photo document it using my photography and video editing skills that I built a little bit of over the years, but never really done anything with. And so began the era of me owning an FC RX-7. And that car took me a lot of places, it really did. So I ended up with that car renting a warehouse in Northeast Portland on Alberta Street, where I had this master plan to make this like creative agency slash entertainment business slash garage. And if you're an OG Portlander, you may actually remember going to parties at that place and hearing some stories about that place. I'm sure all of them are true. And that was just that turned into this crazy side quest of my life that just got way out of proportion. I ended up losing a lot of money, and I ended up shooting some really famous rappers and DJs and stuff, and kind of being this event hub for like traveling musical acts if they like wanted a place to have after parties and stuff. I ended up meeting Machine Gun Kelly and the Flatbush Zombies and Bauer and Foreign Beggars and a bunch of other musical artists, and they would come through the warehouse in like the middle of the night with like a huge entourage and stuff. And it was a pretty crazy time, but I definitely wasn't really learning how to work on cars or being focused on drifting. It was taking up way too much of my time managing this 3,000 square foot warehouse that people lived in, and then doing all this stuff in the nightlife industry. And it was just kind of a shit show. And there was a bunch of like drugs and sex and just all this stuff that kind of screwed up the whole thing. And I had this huge existential break at the end of it. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving. And I broke my lease and I ended up taking all my stuff and I moved to this house in the middle of nowhere in Lapine, Oregon, 30 miles south of Bend, Oregon, literally in the middle of nowhere. Bend itself is in the middle of nowhere. It's just cordoned off in the dead center of Oregon, and the entire rest of Oregon operates down I-5 and over on the west side of Oregon. And even from there, even from Bend, Lapine is even further out. And I ended up just dragging all my stuff down there, and I put the ARC-7 in the garage, and I said, okay, now it's time to focus on building this car. And I spent the entire summer designing and building the car. I did a bunch of stuff with no experience. I completely taught myself how to work on this car. I built the over fenders for it. I went and had it painted. I built the entire interior, took the LS engine apart, put heads and a cam and a bunch of other stuff on it. I was actually getting help from my neighbor at the time. It was like this 55-year-old like boomer guy that I really had no affiliation with prior to living there. He just caught wind that I was building a race car and had some experience with it. So he like came over and basically taught me like how to do most of what I had done. I ended up posting some photos of the car on my Facebook, and it caught the attention of the MACHETE guys, Landon Williams, Joe Ayala, and Ian Dillon. And they were like up and coming media creative dudes that were also doing vehicle graphics, and Factory 83 was sort of within the umbrella of MACHETE. Ian reached out to me and was like, your car is sick. If you ever want a design done on it, let me know. I ended up checking out some of their work and I was absolutely mind blown. To this day, I still say that the MACHETE videos are some of the best automotive content that has ever been produced. And I was like, dude, yeah, like let's do it. Mind you, I'd still never been to a drift event in my life. And so Ian came down, Landon came down, we shot the MACHETE video that you guys may or may not have seen. I'll link it in the description. And we laid the graphics on the RX-7 and went out, did the burnout for the end of the video. And now suddenly I have this built, liveried, ready to go drift car without any seat time. And I was like, well, I tend to respond pretty well under pressure. I'm just gonna go for it and just learn how to drive this car. And I will be damned if I'm gonna be the worst driver out there for long. And so before you know it, I ended up dragging my car out to some events in Southern Oregon. All the guys in Southern Oregon were very welcoming, and I did a pretty good job of not trashing my car and making a fool out of myself. I ended up getting so enamored with the track in Southern Oregon and the available seat time that I ended up moving down there in a custom school bus that I built when I lived in Portland, another side quest. It was kind of meant to be this tow rig type thing, and when I decided to move to Southern Oregon, another one of those seat of the pants decisions where I was like, all right, man, I am getting in this school bus, I'm going to Southern Oregon, and I'm gonna figure it out. And so I did that. I ended up landing and staying with my friend George for like 2 years there. And during that time, I probably was driving 100 days a year for 2 or 3 years that I was down there. That was when the majority of the Item B drift content that you guys may or may not know about was produced. That was my entire journey, just learning how to drive, learning how to make videos, making videos like the style that I wanted and with the music that I liked, and learning how to become a better driver. I attribute all of my driving skill and all of my passion for drifting from those first few years where I was able to just go to the Medford track and get a bunch of seat time all the time. And at the very beginning when I moved down there, there was actually like no rules at that track. It's much, much different now, but back then there wasn't really a lot of events going on. The go-karting down there wasn't really happening, and it was just kind of like left to rot for a while. And I actually ended up getting the gate code to that track with the permission of the people managing it. And there were many, many days during the week where I would just unlock the gate, drive myself in there, bring 6, 8 tires, and I would just drive there by myself, just running random layouts throughout the course. And then also I would just mount a fresh pair of tires, and I would just hard charge the entry corner, do an entry, hit the first corner, then shut it down and drive back to the start line and just do it over and over again, like 40, 50 times in a row sometimes. And that was huge for the development of my driving abilities and my confidence level. And I really, really owe a lot of how quickly I progressed in drifting to those early years where I was able to just drive and not have to spend a ton of money. I was literally dumpster diving tires out of the dealership parking lots, taking my car to the track and driving, so the whole thing was just free. And I ended up doing that for a really long time. So after a while, I'm actually from the Portland area, and I was beginning to get a little burnt out on Southern Oregon as a whole. It's really hot down there. There's fire season where the air quality just turns to shit, and it's really smoky all summer. And I was kind of ready to return to Portland. While I was up here, I at first brought the RX-7 back to Portland, but at that point I had owned the car for 4.5 years. I had rebuilt the car 3 different times. So I ended up returning to the Portland area with the RX-7 in tow. I'd done a lot with this car at this point, and I learned a lot of things about drifting at this point. So I learned a lot about car setup and vehicle dynamics. When I first got into drifting, I had this feeling that all drift cars would essentially feel the same if you set them up the same. And I really had no idea how wheelbase and suspension design and all that stuff sort of factored into how a drift car felt at the end of the day. And I had this notion that if you just build the car, that the end result was going to be that the car felt and drove like the option videos that you used to see of people with perfectly set up Pro D1 cars. And I learned over the course of the last 5 years prior to that RX-7s do not drive like that. They have really, really fast steering, unbelievably fast steering, like a turn and a half lock to lock, depending on your steering angle kit. They're really twitchy and short wheelbase. The driver position is closer to the rear wheels than the front, so you get that pendulum swinging effect. And over the years, I revamped the car a whole bunch of different ways, but I could never really get the car to drive exactly the way I wanted it to. And at this point, I had probably put around $60,000 into the car between all of its various mechanical and aesthetic changes. And I decided that I just wanted to drive something different. For a long time, actually, I wanted to drive something different. For about 2 years prior to getting rid of the RX-7, I wanted to drive something different. But I felt like I was so typecast in being Evan with the RX-7 that I was going to disappoint my fans and followers that I'd worked so hard to try to create content for, and that I had this, half a decade saga with the RX-7 that I just didn't want to let die. And so for a long time I just kind of grinned and just continued on with the RX-7, even though secretly in my mind I wanted to drive a different type of car. And I knew I didn't want to drive a 240SX or really even another Japanese car. And during that time I did try out a couple of different cars. Some of you may remember I had a 1J swapped Cressida for a while, and I had always bought and sold some cars here and there that I was trying out. But during my buying and selling and sort of just tinkering with other project cars over the course of those 5 years, I would always buy and sell E36 BMWs, and I thought that they were really, really cool cars, E36s and E46s. And when Don Musk put out that wide body E46 coupe in Poland, 2017 I think, or 2016 was the year that it got painted red and was supercharged, and seeing that car just like, it burned an image into my mind that I wanted to change chassis so bad. And seeing his car when it was painted red with his wide body on it made me just never forget about it at all. Every time I looked at my car, I thought, man, I want to drive a BMW. I want to drive a BMW. So after a while, I actually ended up parting out the RX-7. I posted a part out ad just in a complete surprise on my Instagram with the full price list for everything in the car. I ended up selling every part off of that car off my Instagram in 2.5 hours, all the way down to a bare chassis. And that sort of began as the base budget for the next project. I ended up building a 2J swapped E46 coupe. Some of you may remember that car. That car was one of those cars that you write everything down on paper and it's a really cool car, but then you actually go out and try to drift the car and it's just not fun. It's really a difficult thing to describe because you would think, oh man, like E46 coupe, 400 horsepower 2J, M3 rear end, SLR kit, big wheels, all this shit, and you just go out and drive the car and it just wasn't fun. The car weighed 3,500 pounds. The front wheels were a -20 offset. The car only made 375, if we're being exact, wheel horsepower, and it had a full interior. It was a very, very long wheelbase car compared to the RX-7, and I really wasn't prepared for the way that the car was actually going to drive. It was slow, like really slow. Like clutch kick it multiple times through a long sweeper corner slow. And for a long time, probably about a year, I kept trying to make myself enjoy that thing. I actually went on a cross-country trip to Florida to try to drive it at some events down there and in the other parts of the Deep South like Alabama. And I ended up taking the car to PBIR and to Mid-Pond Circuit, where I actually ended up seizing the engine. And the car was running fine. I actually went to go refuel it. So I left the track and I drove it into town to a gas station. And when I came to a stoplight, the car shut off and it just would not start again. And we actually could not get the starter to turn the engine until Justin Maples saw me in a intersection and helped me push it to a gas station. And then Chase from Chase Bays came in his truck and trailer later that day and saved me. We tried to figure out what was wrong with the car, and in doing our diagnosis, we actually towed the car behind his truck with a tow strap, and I bump started it, and the car started and it just immediately started knocking. And so I was like, well, shit, that's my trip. And there I was, 2,800 miles away from my house and with a seized engine car. Luckily, it was being trailered by the RV that we were traveling in, so I wasn't stranded there, but my day of drifting was done. After sorting the car out and figuring out a place for it and everything, I went back to the track to go watch everybody drift, and another one of the Chase Bays employees, Johnny Wilds, did like the chillest thing ever for me. He actually showed up at the track with a fully prepared E36 drift car that he had won in a raffle on Chelsea DeNofa's Instagram. Chelsea DeNofa prepared this car called the Stancer Dancer, and he actually gave it away. Lo and behold, Johnny Wilds from Chase Bays won the car, and he brought the car for me to drift. So I was like eternally thankful. I don't usually like to drive other people's cars because I'm afraid of breaking them, or I'm afraid that their poor build quality is going to cause them to break, and then I'm going to be the bad guy. So most of the time, someone says drive my car, I just say no, I'm good. But I had no car, I'd come a long way, so this time I decided, sure man, I'll drive your car, thank you so much. And I actually ended up taking it out, and with absolutely no seat time in that car, absolutely no experience driving a car with 170 horsepower, I just went out and laced up Mid-Pond Circuit like 10 consecutive hot laps in the car, driving it with total aggression at 100%, and not making really a single error in the car. And that experience drifting that car, I would say, completely changed my life and my perspective on drifting. It was definitely one of the most fun times I've ever had drifting, and I was just taking solo laps in a mainly stock engine M50 325i sedan with a good suspension tune and a dual caliper setup. And I literally came in from those laps like shaking and like adrenaline rushing, and I literally was like, that's the coolest thing I've ever done. I want to do more of that. I can't believe that didn't cost me any tire wear. That's what I want. I ended up towing the E46 back to Oregon. I replaced the engine and I ended up selling it to a guy in Virginia, and I took the money from that E46 and I started building an E36. And it took me about 4 E36s before I ended up resting upon that exact chassis. But I started taking that money and dinking around with E36s. I had this Avis Blue sedan that I started building, but I couldn't get over the fact that it wasn't white. And then I ended up with a white M3 that had an M52 swapped into it that I got for super cheap. And then I ended up getting offered my current car, which is a 328 IS. And the reason that I ended up taking this car was because it already had a welded half cage, it had a 1/4-inch plate steel subframe reinforcement kit, and it also had a chase base dual caliper system. It actually got the car closer to completion than the M3 that I had at the time, and it had the same power plant. So I ended up just pulling all the aero and all the other crap off of that car, putting it on my current car, and selling the M3 with some stock stuff. And that kind of catches us up car-wise, drifting-wise, to where I'm at now. Now, I actually do have 4 drift cars right now. You guys saw the video about the 128. I've got the YE36 that now is getting an LS power plant. And then I have 2 other cars that I am not going to reveal during this video that have very, very different plans and applications that you guys are going to see more videos about here in the future. But I don't want to get super deep into kind of the history of Auto Handler as a business or professionally, like what we're doing here at Auto Handler and how that came to be. I feel like that's kind of more of a video for another day. This video is kind of more so just my own personal history with drifting and my relationship with it from when I discovered it to the present day. So hopefully that provides a little bit of insight for those of you guys that have been following me for a while, and maybe you've seen some of these changes happen or these places that I've gone, or maybe you've actually been following me since all the way back in the day when I had that warehouse and the RX-7 wasn't even built yet. I'm sure you've seen the cars change and the locale change, and off I went to Bend or, you know, to Southern Oregon or the school bus days or this or that without really knowing what was sitting behind those changes or why I was making them. Hopefully this video helps you guys kind of figure out and piece together and connect the dots on the timeline as to where we are now. There's a bunch of side quests within this story that I could share with you guys, just like random stuff from traveling days, random stuff from Southern Oregon, from Bend. I actually even went down to LA and ended up working for Hoonigan for just a couple of months at the Donut Garage right before they started doing YouTube, which is an adventure all of its own. Another thing that I've never really talked about publicly or shared my experience with. If you guys want to hear more of these stories, please let me know in the comments. I would absolutely love to share more of them with you. I have a million of them. All my friends ask me like when I'm going to write a book, but I feel like I'm still living through the body of the text, and so I haven't really considered, you know, penning anything down. So this might be a fun way for me to share some of the crazy shit that I've been through over the years and let you guys get to know me a little bit better. It's gonna be really hot here over the weekend, so I'm gonna try to get this chopped up and put out because I'm not going outside. My filmer Jacob is out of town, and all my cars are getting worked on, so nothing is really ready to drive. I can't go make any drifting content, but I wanna stay true to my commitment to you guys to make 2 videos a week. And so hopefully you guys enjoyed this. If you do enjoy this format or just hearing me talk and sharing old footage and stuff like that, please let me know and I'll continue to do it. You name the topic, or I've got a bunch of stuff I'd love to talk to you guys about. All right guys, I'll catch you later.